The wind, a malevolent sculptor, had long since stripped the land bare, leaving only skeletal trees and a persistent, biting cold that gnawed at bone and hope alike. Alara huddled deeper into the threadbare shawl, its faded wool offering scant defense against the dust-laden gusts that whipped through the desolate streets of Oakhaven. Her breath plumed in ragged clouds, each exhalation a visible testament to her desperation. She had arrived 3 days ago, a ghost-like figure emerging from the barren plains, clutching a single, worn satchel, the last tangible link to a life that had vanished as quickly as a summer storm. Her parents, taken by the fever in a remote homestead, had left her with little more than a whisper of their love and the daunting task of survival. Oakhaven, a collection of ramshackle buildings clustered around a single muddy track, was not the sanctuary she had imagined, but a harsher, colder extension of the wilderness she had traversed. Fear, cold and sharp as a honed blade, was her constant companion. It coiled in her gut, tightened her throat, and blurred the edges of her vision. Every passing glance from the rough men who frequented the dusty saloon, every calculating stare from the women who eyed her thin frame, was a fresh prick of terror. She was alone, utterly and irrevocably, a young woman adrift in a world that saw vulnerability as an invitation to prey. The few coins she possessed were almost gone, spent on meager rations that barely staved off the gnawing hunger. Tonight, she had no place to lay her head, no warmth to blunt the edge of the encroaching night. The thought of sleeping outdoors, exposed to the elements and the predatory eyes, sent a shiver deeper than any wind. Her gaze, skittering like a trapped bird, fell upon him. He sat alone at a table in the corner of the saloon, a hulking silhouette against the dim lamplight. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but she could discern the broad set of his shoulders, the quiet, formidable presence that seemed to absorb the raucous noise of the room without effort. He was an outsider, like her, but possessed a strength she could only dream of. His worn leather coat, scarred and aged, spoke of long journeys and hard-won battles. His hands, resting on the table, were calloused and powerful. She had watched him since early morning, observed his stoic demeanor, the way men seemed to give him a wide berth. He was named Caleb. She'd overheard someone mutter, a drifter, a man of few words and, reputedly, fewer friends. A desperate, wild notion took root in her mind, a seed of an idea born from sheer terror and a primal will to survive. It was audacious, reckless, yet it felt like her only chance. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of apprehension. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, to hide, but there was nowhere left to go. Taking a slow, measured breath, she pushed herself away from the wall, her legs feeling strangely disconnected from her will. Each step towards his table was an agonizing effort, a battle against the overwhelming wave of shame and vulnerability. The noise of the saloon seemed to recede, leaving only the thunder of her own pulse in her ears. She stopped beside his table, her shadow falling across his large, still hand. She swallowed, her throat dry and constricted. He did not look up immediately, but she felt his awareness, a quiet shift in the air around him. Finally, slowly, he raised his head. His eyes, in the dim light, were a startlingly pale blue, sharp and assessing, holding neither welcome nor malice, only a profound, weary neutrality. They seemed to pierce right through her, laying bare her fear, her destitution. Her voice, when it emerged, was a raw, fragile whisper, barely audible above the saloon's din. Yet it felt as though she was shouting into the vast emptiness of the plains. "Sir," she began, her gaze fixed on a button on his coat, unable to meet the intensity of his stare. I have nowhere to go tonight. There are men. They look at me." Her voice faltered, catching on a lump of fear. She took another shallow breath, forcing the words out, each one a monumental effort, a piece of her pride flayed bare. "Sir, could you act to be my father, just for one night?" The question hung in the air, audacious and impossibly vulnerable, a desperate plea from a drowning soul. His expression remained unreadable, his pale eyes unblinking. The silence stretched, long and excruciating, filled only by the distant murmur of voices and the mournful whine of the wind outside. She waited, trembling, for the inevitable rejection. Caleb's silence was a heavy, impenetrable shroud. Alara stood frozen, her eyes still fixed on the worn silver button of his coat, the fabric stretched taut across his broad chest. The air in the saloon, thick with stale pipe smoke and the scent of cheap whiskey, suddenly felt too thin to breathe. She could feel the heat of a blush rising on her cheeks, a searing indictment of her audacity. She had asked the impossible, exposed herself to the contempt of a stranger, and now the silence was confirming her folly. She wanted to bolt, to disappear back into the anonymity of the shadows, but her legs were rooted to the spot, held captive by the fragile thread of a desperate hope. She squeezed her eyes shut for a fleeting moment, bracing herself for the inevitable, gruff dismissal. Then a sound. Not words, but a low, guttural sigh. A sound of weary resignation more than annoyance. She opened her eyes, startled. Caleb had not moved, but his gaze had shifted slightly, now resting on the empty chair opposite him. He remained silent, his face unreadable, etched with lines that spoke of a hard life. It was not an invitation, not yet, but it wasn't a dismissal either. It was an acknowledgement, a grudging concession that perhaps, in this godforsaken place, desperation could sometimes warrant an unusual response. Alara hesitated, not daring to believe, searching his impassive face for any hint of a trap, a cruel jest. But there was nothing, only that deep, profound weariness. Tentatively, her heart still thrumming against her ribs, she sank into the chair. It scraped loudly against the wooden floorboards, a jarring sound in the sudden quiet that seemed to have fallen over their corner of the room. Her presence drew a few curious glances, swiftly diverted when eyes met Caleb's unblinking stare. He emitted a low grunt, a sound that seemed to pass for communication, and pushed a tin cup of lukewarm coffee across the table towards her. It was a gesture so small, so simple, yet in that moment, it felt like an offering of immense significance. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against the warm metal, a surprising comfort. She lifted the cup, the bitter taste a shock to her parched throat, but it was warm and it was hers. She risked a glance at him, trying to discern the motivations behind this strange, unspoken agreement. Was it pity, a fleeting sense of responsibility, or simply the weary acceptance of a world where one sometimes had to make do with unusual arrangements? He ordered a meal, 2 plates of stew, thick and savory, brought by a nervous barman who clearly wished to minimize his interaction with the silent man in the corner. Caleb ate slowly, methodically, not looking at her, not speaking. Alara ate too, ravenously at first, then more slowly, savoring each mouthful. It was the first substantial meal she had consumed in days, and the warmth spread through her, a small, fragile seed of comfort in the vast cold. She watched him covertly, observing the unhurried strength in his movements, the way he seemed completely self-contained. He was a man accustomed to solitude, to hardship, to relying only on himself. Yet, here he was, sharing his table, his meager warmth, with a complete stranger who had dared to ask the unimaginable. The saloon grew steadily louder as the night wore on, the air growing heavier with smoke and the boisterous shouts of drunken men. Alara felt eyes on her, lingering, assessing. A group of rough-looking cowboys, loud and reeking of whiskey, stumbled past their table. One of them, a man with a scarred face and a predatory grin, paused, his gaze lingering on Alara. His eyes, glinting with unpleasant intent, dropped to her slender frame, then flickered to Caleb. He opened his mouth, a crude remark forming on his lips. Before he could utter a word, Caleb subtly shifted, leaning back in his chair, his hand moving, almost imperceptibly, towards the heavy Colt holstered at his hip. His pale eyes, previously neutral, now held a glint of cold steel. The scarred man's grin faltered, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly as he met Caleb's gaze. Without a word, he swallowed the unspoken insult, cleared his throat, and roughly nudged his companions forward, their boisterous laughter abruptly cut short as they stumbled away. Caleb did not even look at Alara, his hand returning to the table, his posture unchanged. But she had seen it, the swift, silent threat, the protective stance. He had claimed her without a word as his. A wave of profound, unfamiliar gratitude washed over her, mixing with a newfound sense of safety. She felt, for the first time in a long time, as though she could breathe. The night stretched before them, a fragile, unspoken truce, and Alara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she had made the right choice. The night outside raged, a symphony of howling wind and rattling windows, each gust sounding like a hungry beast at the door. Inside, the saloon's cacophony slowly dwindled as patrons stumbled out into the frigid darkness. Only a few hardy souls remained, hunched over their drinks, their faces illuminated by the flickering lamplight. Caleb remained impassive, his presence a silent anchor in the swirling unease. Alara, though still watchful, felt the protective cloak of his proximity. She noticed the subtle shifts in his posture, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw when certain eyes lingered too long in their direction. He wasn't simply acting. He was embodying the role, his quiet authority warding off any unwanted advances without uttering a single word. His commitment, though unspoken, was absolute. Around midnight, a particularly loud drunk, emboldened by liquor and a lack of sense, veered towards their table. He was a burly man, his face flushed and distorted, and he stumbled, nearly tripping over a chair, before righting himself and fixing his bloodshot eyes on Alara. "Well, well, what do we have here?" he slurred, a lecherous grin spreading across his face. "A pretty little bird, out with her old man?" His gaze swept over Caleb, laced with a sneer of dismissive contempt. "She looks too young for ya, Gramps. Why don't you let a real man show her a good time?" Alara's breath hitched. Her blood ran cold. This was it. The facade would break. Caleb, she thought, would simply remove his protection, perhaps even offer her up to the man to avoid trouble himself. Her heart hammered, a frantic drum against her ribs. She braced herself, ready to bolt, ready to run into the freezing night, anything to escape the vile intention in the man's eyes. But Caleb did not move. Not a muscle twitched in his face. His pale eyes, however, seemed to darken, narrowing into slits of cold, unwavering resolve. The air around them crackled with an unseen tension. It was the predator meeting a force far more formidable than itself. The drunk, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere, took another step closer, his hand reaching out, fingers splayed, as if to grasp Alara's arm. In that instant, Caleb moved, not with a shout, not with a sudden lunge, but with an economy of motion that was terrifying in its precision. His right hand, impossibly fast, shot out and seized the drunk's wrist in an iron grip. There was no struggle. The drunk's face contorted, not in pain, but in stunned disbelief, his eyes widening. Caleb's grip tightened, and with a barely perceptible twist of his wrist, a soft, sickening pop echoed in the relative quiet of their corner. The drunk gasped, a choked sound, his eyes rolling back in his head as he instantly sobered. His arm, limp and useless, dropped to his side. Caleb released him, a faint sneer gracing his lips. The drunk, pale and trembling, stumbled backward, cradling his wrist, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. He looked at Caleb, then at Alara, a flicker of pure terror in his eyes, before he turned and stumbled out of the saloon, whimpering. Alara watched the entire exchange, mesmerized. It had been swift, brutal, and utterly silent. No words, no threats, just a swift, decisive action that had cemented Caleb's unspoken claim. He had protected her, not out of duty, but with a fierce, quiet resolve that spoke of something deeper. Her fear, which had been a constant companion, began to recede, replaced by a profound awe. He had not abandoned her. He had not hesitated. He had faced down a threat for her, a complete stranger, fulfilling the role she had asked of him with a terrifying efficiency. She looked at his hand, the one that had just broken a man's will, and then at his profile, still impassive, as if nothing untoward had happened. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. She expected no response and received none. Yet, she felt a shift within herself. The desperate, cowering girl who had walked into the saloon hours ago was gone. In her place, a flicker of strength, a nascent resolve. She had seen the raw, uncompromising nature of survival and had witnessed an unexpected ally. The fear had not vanished entirely, but it no longer consumed her. She looked at Caleb, truly looked at him, seeing past the gruff exterior, past the stoic silence, to the quiet strength that lay beneath. He was not her father, not by blood, but he had acted as one, providing a shield against a harsh world. And in that moment, in the aftermath of the quiet violence, their strange, improbable connection deepened, forging itself in the crucible of shared danger. The first sliver of dawn, cold and colorless, began to bleed across the eastern sky, painting the desolate landscape in muted shades of gray and bruised purple. Inside the saloon, a few embers still glowed in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows. The air was still thick with the lingering scent of stale whiskey and wood smoke, but the boisterous clamor of the previous night had vanished, replaced by a profound stillness. Elara shifted in her chair, stiff and weary, but no longer trembling. The fear had receded, replaced by an unfamiliar sensation. A quiet dignity, a sense of having survived. Caleb, who had appeared to sleep upright in his chair, a silent, imposing guardian, now stirred. He rose with a quiet grace surprising for a man of his build, stretching his broad shoulders, a low grunt escaping his lips. He moved to the bar, retrieved a kettle of water heated over the dying embers, and poured himself a cup of coffee. He offered another to Elara, his gaze meeting hers for the first time since the previous night's confrontation. His pale eyes held no judgment, no expectation, only a quiet acknowledgement of the shared experience. She accepted the cup, her fingers warming around the familiar tin, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips. It was a fleeting gesture, unpracticed and perhaps even hesitant, but it was there. "I owe you," she said, her voice stronger than she expected, no longer the desperate whisper of the night before. "More than I can say." He took a slow sip of his coffee, his eyes scanning the empty room, then settling back on her. "No debt," he rumbled, his voice a low growl, rough from disuse. "You asked." "I did." It was typical of his economy with words, yet in its brevity, it carried a weight of honest acceptance. He wasn't looking for gratitude, only understanding. Elara looked down at her hands, turning the warm cup slowly. She understood. He was a man who lived by his own code, a simple, direct one. He had fulfilled his part of the unspoken bargain, and that was that. But for her, it was far more than just a transaction. That one night had been a crucible, melting away her despair and forging something new in its place. She was still alone, still facing an uncertain future, but the fear that had paralyzed her was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet resolve, a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Caleb had not given her answers, nor a solution to her predicament, but he had given her something infinitely more valuable, the belief in her own resilience. He had shown her that even in the harshest of worlds, unexpected kindness, raw protection, and unwavering integrity could exist. She watched him as he finished his coffee, his movements unhurried, purposeful. He moved towards the door, stopping to retrieve his worn saddlebag from a peg. He was a drifter, and the road called to him as it always would. He was not one to linger, nor to form attachments. Their paths, having converged so dramatically for a single pivotal night, were now diverging once more. Elara knew this, accepted it. Just before he pushed open the heavy saloon door, letting in a gust of frigid air and the faint scent of pine, he paused. He turned his head slightly, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer than usual. "Stay clear of trouble," he advised, his voice still low, almost a whisper, but laced with a surprising undertone of genuine concern. It was the closest thing to a farewell or even a blessing he was likely to offer. Alara met his gaze, her own eyes steady and clear. She nodded slowly, a silent promise to herself as much as to him. "I will." He nodded once, curtly, then pushed through the door and stepped out into the stark, awakening light of dawn. She watched through the grimy window as he mounted his horse, a dark silhouette against the vast, empty plains. He did not look back. He simply rode, disappearing quickly into the immensity of the landscape, leaving only the fading echo of hooves on frozen earth. Alara remained by the window for a long time, the warmth of the coffee seeping into her hands. The night was over. The facade was no longer needed, but the influence of that one night, of that one stoic man, was indelible. He had given her a shield, and in doing so had taught her to find her own sword. She still faced the same harsh world, but now she faced it with a different heart. The desperate girl who had begged for a father was gone. In her place stood a woman, weary but unbroken, ready to meet the new day and whatever challenges it might bring, with a quiet strength she had found in the most unexpected of places. The journey ahead was still long, still uncertain, but she would face it, head held high, walking with a newfound dignity she had earned in the crucible of a single, transformative night.